How does the market value CGC 9.9 comics, and is that going to change? As CGC 9.9 grades become more common, how is that going to affect values of the existing 9.9s that are in the market today? Let's look at some data and talk about it. Hello and welcome to New Compass Collectibles, my YouTube channel where I talk about comic books and comic book data. If you're new here, thanks for joining me. Please like the video, subscribe so you can see more content like this, and share the channel with others who might be interested in this sort of topic. On the channel, we look at a lot of comic book data. That includes looking at auction results from recent auctions, highlighting interesting sales, and probably my favorite videos to make will be videos like this, where we can use data to help guide the conversation on some interesting topics in the hobby. A hot topic lately is CGC 9.9 comics. This has been a conversation for a while now, and we're starting to see more 9.9s hit the market. So what is that going to do to values? Today we're going to look at some historical data to get some insight into how 9.9s are valued in the industry today and how that might change as more 9.9s hit the census in the future. I'm going to be looking at historical sales that I collected from the Heritage Auctions website. So they record a lot of sales over the years, and there have been a number of 9.9s that have sold on the platform. So I'm going to use that data to try to get an understanding for how 9.9s have performed in the market so far to date, and then we can talk about how that might change going forward. But first, let me just give my quick take on 9.9s in general. I have bought a lot of comic books, but I've never bought a 9.9 or a 10.0. I just don't value them that highly compared to a 9.8 grade. To me, I just don't think you can tell the difference between a 9.8, a 9.9, or a 10.0 all that easily. I think if you were to submit the 9.9s that are already out in the market today, or even the 10.0s, again for regrading, I don't know how many of them would come back with the same grade. Now, I've never seen a 9.9 or 10.0 in person, so maybe that would change my mind. But just looking at the slabs that we've seen on the market today, visibly, I just don't see a huge difference between 9.8s, 9.9s, and 10.0s. And I'm not confident that professional CGC graders can either. I know there are many fewer 9.9s and 10.0s out there currently, but I've just never valued them that differently compared to a 9.8. Obviously, the market disagrees. They get huge premiums and make huge sales when they do come on the market. To me, I think this is a classic case of buying the label and not the book. So often the advice is given that you should be paying for a comic based on the book that's in the slab, not the slab itself. I just don't think the grading standards are there to be able to definitively say that something is a 9.8 or a 9.9 or a 10.0. I think we've all seen 9.8s that vary in quality. Some have more defects than others. Some present better than others. And I think the 9.9 and 10.0 is best viewed as a way of distinguishing the better presenting 9.8s from the average 9.8. I think the term of comparative grading, which Ryan at Automatic Comics first used, I think, makes a lot of sense to me. I don't value that super highly. CGC grades are great for establishing market value, and for the most part, they're pretty accurate. It allows us to have conversations around what the value of a graded comic should be, but at the end of the day, you're still buying the comic book. You're not buying the slab. So you should be evaluating what the book looks like, how it presents, and its value compared to historical sales. With 9.9 and 10.0 comics, I just don't think the difference is noticeable enough in terms of quality to justify the premiums that are paid over the 9.8 price. The only thing that really justifies that is the scarcity of the label itself. The grade that's put on that label and how few there are in the market is what justifies those premiums. So as the grading standards seem to change, or at least the application of those grading standards changes, and more 9.9s come on the census, we're going to see those values be affected. So that's my 2 cents on collecting 9.9s. I just think the difference between a 9.8 and a 9.9 is a little too subjective for my taste. And if you're buying a 9.9, you're really doing it based on that grade that's put on the label and not necessarily based on the book that's inside the slab. And you're taking a risk that the relative scarcity is going to change in the future, which may be happening now. So let's talk about what data we're going to be looking at today. I went back and looked at the Heritage sales from their website from early 2000s to today for all CGC 9.9 graded slabs. I looked at the 9.9 sale and then compared that to the recent 9.8 sales of the same book. And that gave me a multiplier for the 9.9 compared to the 9.8 value. So if a 9.9 sold for $1,000 and a 9.8 sold for 100, that's a multiplier of 10x. This spreadsheet shows all of the data that I collected. So there are 308 total sales, so 308 rows in this table. These are all the 9.9 sales that were on the Heritage website. And then these columns on the right is the comparable sales. So these are the recent sales in the 9.8 grade of the same issue, and then the value of the 9.8 graded comic. If these columns are blank, then that means there were no comparable sales, so I'm not able to calculate the 9.9 multiplier because I have nothing to compare to for the 9.8. Now I could go and populate these values from like GPA if I wanted to do that more manually, but I didn't take the time to do that for this video. So we're going to be looking at only the sales where there was both a 9.9 sale and recent 9.8 sales to compare to. This first chart that we're looking at is all of the issues that had the highest number of 9.9 sales in this data set. So Spider-Man #1, issued in 1990, has the most 9.9 sales recorded in Heritage's sales history. The challenge with this one, though, is that there are a lot of different variants. So this is Spider-Man 1, the gold variant, the silver variant, polybagged, unbagged. So it was kind of difficult to do comparisons for this one. So I actually took this one out of the data set in terms of my analysis. Some of the other issues here that have a lot of sales data that we'll be interested in: Secret Wars #8 had 8 sales in a 9.9. Wolverine Limited Series #1 had 5 sales in a 9.9. You can see there's a mix of some Bronze Age and some more modern and Copper Age books. In total, we have 308 sales in the Heritage Auctions historical data to look at. This next chart is only looking at the issues that we actually have comparable sales for. So we actually have 118 sales of 9.9 slabs where there was available 9.8 sales data for comparison. One thing about doing the analysis this way is that if 9.8 sales are not recorded in Heritage, then there won't be any comparison to the 9.9. So this is going to eliminate sales of a 9.9 book that's really only valuable because it's a 9.9. If the 9.8 isn't valuable enough to sell on Heritage on its own, then there's going to be no 9.8 comparison in that data for the 9.9 sale. I could go to GPA and get values for those 9.8s for comparison, but I don't really want to count those in the analysis anyway, because if the 9.8 isn't valuable and sought after on its own, then I'm not really concerned about the 9.9 value. Okay, now this chart is showing every 9.9 sale based on the year of publication for the book being sold. So the year of publication is on the x-axis, and then the y-axis is the multiplier compared to the 9.8 value, the multiplier that the 9.9 sale recorded as. So you can see that a lot of the 9.9 sales in this data was from the late 70s to the early 90s. So late Bronze Age through Copper Age time frame. Now part of that is because any high-grade modern 9.9s either are probably not being sold on Heritage, or there are no 9.8s of those being sold on Heritage for me to do a comparison with. And you can see a wide range in this data. There's some as low as low single-digit multipliers and some as high as over 60 multipliers. So there's a wide range of data, and we want to try to find some meaning, some trend in this data, hopefully through this analysis. Now this next chart is showing the same sales, but instead of the year of publication on the x-axis, we're looking at the year of the sale, the actual transaction date. So you can see a lot of sales around the 2009 to 2010 timeframe. There were a lot of 9.9s that were sold on Heritage, and I'm not exactly sure why that is, if they were graded as 9.9s around that time, or if Heritage just had an emphasis on getting 9.9s on the market. But you could see a lot of transactions happening in that 2009 to 2010 period of time. You can see the sales from that 2009 to 2010 period had a wide range of multipliers, from low single digits all the way up to over 50. And you can see from the sales that were most recently in 2023 and 24, there's still a wide range of multipliers. So there's no one consistent, like, oh yeah, just take the 9.8 value, multiply it by 10, by 15, and you'll get an estimate for the 9.9 value. I tried grouping all of this data to see if there was a trend. So all of the transactions in a given year, I took the average multiplier and plotted that out just to see if there was, over time, any change in how people were valuing 9.9s. There really isn't a consistent trend here, I would say. I don't think there's enough data for us to rely on the trends that are being shown in this particular plot. It is interesting that in the very first year that we had a lot of 9.9 sales, you can see that this first year we had close to 30 9.9s that sold. The average multiplier for a 9.9 was close to 15. So 15 times the value of the 9.8. And we've gone up and down around that number really ever since. Until just this year, you can see the data point is higher, over 25, but there are fewer sales this year, so it could be affected by a few outlier sales. In fact, looking at the original table where this data came from, I have it sorted now by transaction date, so all of the sales from 2024 are at the top. And we can see some big outliers, like this one was a 62x multiplier. So this was Daredevil number 181, had a 9.9 sell for $10,200, whereas the 9.8 was valued around 164 at the time. Similarly, we have this New Mutants number 100 sold for 64 times the 9.8 price. A 9.9 sold in April for $5,760. The 9.8 at the time was around $89. So it looks like these low dollar 9.8s have some very high 9.9 sales that skew the results. So here's one more look at this data. We're looking at the 9.9 multiplier, again on the y-axis, but this time I'm plotting it against the value of the 9.8. So you can see that on the left of this chart, the low value 9.8s, they have a wide range of 9.9 values. So those 9.9 multipliers can range from low single digits all the way up to over 60. It seems like since the 9.8 values for these books are pretty low, like they're not in-demand chase keys, the 9.9 values are a little more detached from the value of the 9.8. If you look at the higher value 9.8s, say $300 or $400 and higher, that really puts a limit on what the 9.9 multiplier can be. In these higher ranges, it seems like there's really not much more than like a 22 or 23 multiplier that you can see or expect for a 9.9 sale. And the higher value the 9.8 is, the less of a multiplier we're seeing on the 9.9 sales. Now keep in mind, there aren't a lot of 9.8s that are worth multiple thousands of dollars that also have 9.9s on the census. You know, that number of books is pretty small. But that may be changing as more 9.9s are introduced to some Bronze Age keys that we haven't seen them in before. So this is starting to show us some interesting trends in the data. The lower value 9.8s, it's harder to predict what a 9.9 will sell for. The more valuable the 9.8 is, it does seem like there's some relationship, some trend there in terms of a 9.9 multiplier to the 9.8 value. So what I did next in this analysis was to remove some of those low dollar books from the data altogether. So if the 9.8 was valued at less than $250, I took it out of the data set completely. This allowed me to focus on just the 9.8 books that have enough demand for the 9.8 to be valuable on its own, and then compare the 9.9 sales of those issues. So this gets us to 44 total sales of 9.9 slab comics from Heritage Auctions history, where we also have a recently sold 9.8 that we can use for comparative value. The most frequently sold issues are Secret Wars number 8, Wolverine Limited Series number 1, Amazing Spider-Man number 194, TMNT The Last Ronin number 1, Back to the Future number 1, The Amazing Spider-Man number 252, and The Goon number 3. So let's look at those 44 sales in more depth. We'll plot them the same way that we did the larger data set earlier, just to see how things have changed. This is the plot showing the year of publication for those 44 sales. You can see we're not looking at just Bronze Age or early Copper Age books. These are across late Bronze Age to even modern books, printed as early or as recently as 2020. This is the chart showing the 9.9 multipliers for these 44 sales, and showing that versus the date of transaction. So going back all the way to 2004 to today, there's a wide range here still of premiums that were paid. The 9.9 multiplier goes from the single digits all the way up to close to 30 at this point. There are a couple outliers. Wolverine number 1 had a signature series 9.9 that sold for a high multiple. That makes sense because it's a signature series, so it's more rare. The X-Men 141 is a surprising outlier, so that was a 9.9 that sold, but that sold back in 2009, where I think it was probably less established what the multiplier should be for a 9.9 comic. In general, it looks like you should expect the maximum for a 9.9 multiplier to be something under 30, you know, the high 20s, and as low as something like 5, something in the single digits. Now that's a huge range, so not very helpful if you're trying to price out comics. Fortunately, I do think we have a way to narrow this down a little bit further. Here again are the 9.9 multipliers plotted against the 9.8 FMV. So here I think we're definitely starting to see a trend. The higher the value of the 9.8 is, the lower the cap is in terms of the 9.9 multiplier. And I think that makes intuitive sense. You know, if you have a $2,000 9.8, it's going to be hard to find a buyer for a 40x multiplier on a 9.9. That would be an $80,000 book. And there are only so many people interested in 9.9 comics. There's only so much money chasing after those kinds of things. But again, this is totally based on historical data, and we know things are evolving in the market. So it'll be interesting to see how this develops and what sales pop up in the future, and do a comparison on a later video. Now, there is one really important factor here that we haven't discussed yet, and it is extremely relevant today. And that is the number of 9.9s on the census. So how does the ratio of 9.8s to 9.9s on the census affect the 9.9 multiplier for sales? Well, what I did is I took all of the top selling issues from our data set and I manually populated the 9.9 to 9.8 census ratio in my data. Now this is based on the census from today, so I didn't go back and calculate what the census was at the time of these 9.9 sales. Now, I think that's okay because there hasn't been too much dramatic change in 9.9 or 9.8 census over the years until recently. I think we know that we should expect 9.9s to change going forward, which is why I wanted to do this analysis now, and then we can do some comparisons later. The one adjustment I did make was to subtract 10 from the 9.9 census from Wolverine number 1. We know that the census is currently 39 copies, but as of a month ago or 2 months ago, it was only 29 copies, I believe. So I took those 10 copies off and I used a census of 29 9.9s for my data. Because at the time of these sales, there were only around 29 copies or fewer on the census. So looking at the 9.9 census versus the 9.9 multiplier, I think we're now seeing a really strong trend. This was very encouraging because before I wasn't seeing the trends that I wanted to see in the data until I got to this point. So this is plotting the 9.9 census ratio on the x-axis. That's how many 9.8s are on the census divided by how many 9.9s are on the census. And on the y-axis, we have the 9.9 multiplier. So we have the 9.9 sale price versus the 9.8 sale price. And these two seem highly correlated, which is not too surprising. If a 9.9 is very scarce compared to a 9.8, then the multiplier should be higher. Now this is extremely relevant for all of the 9.9s that we think may be coming on the census. If you're holding a 9.9, you're holding it because you think it's scarce. You paid a high price probably because it was scarce at the time. But as more 9.9s hit the census, I mean, this clearly shows the relationship between adding more copies to the census and a decrease in that multiplier in price. Just to clean this chart up a little bit, I grouped all of the points here by issue, and I took an average for each issue and plotted those separately. So now we're looking at all of the data that I populated 9.9 census data for. So we're looking at 8 total books. You can see 4 of them are grouped down towards the lower left. The writing is overlapping, so you can't read each of these, but it's the Goon number 3, Snatch number 3, TMNT The Last Ronin number 1, and Zap Comics number 1. This grouping in the bottom left is where the 9.9s are a little more common, at least common compared to the 9.8 census. So they just don't get a high multiplier. It looks like somewhere around 2 to 4 times the 9.8 price. Now compare that to the other 4 names that we have on this list. Now these are the 4 titles that I think are going to be really interesting to watch in the future in terms of how many 9.9s are on the census, how many more 9.9s do we get, and how much do they sell for when they hit the market. Amazing Spider-Man 194, Amazing Spider-Man 252, Wolverine 1, and Secret Wars number 8 is the one that's cut off on the page here. But even with these 4 books, you can clearly see the trend. The fewer 9.9s there are compared to 9.8s, the higher the multiplier is for that 9.9 sale. The highest being Marvel Superheroes Secret Wars number 8. There's over 250 9.8s for every 9.9 on the census, and that gives it over a 20x multiplier on the market. Now, if we see more 9.9s come on the census, and I'm pretty sure that we will, we're going to see that price correct. We know the same is true for Wolverine number 1. We know that 10 more, at least, 9.9s have hit the census, and there may be more coming. what's that going to do to prices? Well, from this data, I added some trend lines to help guide the conversation a little bit. So if we draw some trends, we can see that it is a pretty linear relationship in terms of the 9.9 census and the 9.9 multiplier. So as that census ratio decreases, the multiplier is going to decrease as well. I wish that I could give a formula and say, yeah, this is what's going to happen to values, but that's just not how the market works. And with the limited data set that we have, I would be skeptical of drawing too many conclusions from it that say one way or another, this is definitively what's going to happen. But it does show the relationship between the census and the prices being realized at auction is important. If you're curious, the slope of this trend line would say, take the census ratio, the 9.8 divided by 9.9 ratio, divide that by 17, and then you'll be somewhere in the ballpark in terms of what the multiplier should be for the 9.9. So if you have 170 copies of 9.8s for every 9.9 on the census, divide that by 17 and you get around a 10x multiplier. That's going to give you a very rough estimate. Again, I wouldn't really use this to kind of come up with a formula for what 9.9 should be valued at, other than to show that the census is really important in terms of determining the 9.9 values. But that being said, I do think I will apply some of these trend lines to these books just to see what would happen if more 9.9s were added to the census. What is this predicting would happen to the 9.9 values? I'll also do that with some other big keys that don't have 9.9s yet, like Amazing Spider-Man 129. If we saw one new copy come on the census or 10 new 9.9s come on the census, what would those potentially sell for? What is the giant size X-Men 9.9 going to sell for in the upcoming Comic Connect auction? Using these trend lines can help us predict some of those values, and I think I'll do that in a future video. If you're interested to see that, please let me know in the comments and I will put that together. But thanks so much for watching this video. I know this data analysis is a little nerdy, but hey, we're here, it's comic book fans, so I hope that's appealing for some of you. So like the video, please subscribe to the channel to support me and see more content like this. Let me know in the comments what you think about this evolving 9.9 market. What did you think of this data? And share the video with others who you think are interested in this topic. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.